Good afternoon and welcome to the first Power Irish series event of 2023. This is a new suite of bite-sized sessions covering critical leadership topics. My name is David McGee and I am the Managing Director of Irish Times Training, and I have the easy job today as your host. Today we kick off on the topic of change management, and throughout the year we'll also cover power skills such as communication, coaching, resilience and digital. But over the next 45 minutes, we'll delve into the business critical area of change management. And change has become the one constant in today's business environment. Skills quickly become outdated, technologies get replaced, competitors emerge from nowhere, and amongst all this, leaders are expected to drive their organizations to the fore. Thus, many leaders have in essence become change managers, constantly directing their organization to the next thing and the next thing after that. However, many change initiatives fail and many become just a set of busy actions rather than really shifting the dial. This morning, I'm delighted to have our expert thought leader in this space, Irial O'Farrell. Irial is an executive coach, a specialist in organizational design, and Ireland's only accredited master in change. Before I hand over to Irial, some housekeeping. This session will be recorded. We will put some time in at the end for Q&A. So there is functionality to post some questions, so please do throughout the session. And without further ado, I'll pass you over to Irial. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to have a look at change and its relationship with projects and success and why we do it. So starting off with project versus change management, what's the relationship between project management and change management? And when I talk about projects, I'm talking about projects or programs. So really the focus of a project or a program is to build the future infrastructure needed to support the desired future outcome where we're going with our change. Whereas the focus of change really is around, are we bringing the human with us? So are we bringing along our people to use the future infrastructure so that the future outcome will be realized, whatever that is? And how do we look at success around projects? A lot of times projects look at success in terms of, was the infrastructure built out? So did we implement the new IT system, or did we build out the new processes that we needed for the future state? But really, we need to look at project success in terms of, did we build out the future state? Did we embed that future state? And has that future state become the way we now work, our ways of working, our business as usual? And where the desired outcomes, benefits from the change, were they realized? A lot of times, as many of you will know, a lot of times organizations embark on change, or they embark on projects, particularly around the IT space. They embark on a new system, and they have numerous new systems that are available in their organization, but they never actually get used. And so the benefits never get realized. Whatever the perceived benefits were, they never get realized, and the outcomes are never achieved. So again, I suppose really, where did change management come from? Where it came from was that realization that some projects were more successful around achieving those outcomes versus other projects. And so what was the difference between the project managers? And there was this observation that actually some project managers brought the people along with them and realized the change that way. And so this was where the change management emerged from. When we look at causes of transformational failures, and again, these are big changes we're talking about here. Peter Drucker, the management guru, is very well noted for having said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And culture also eats change initiatives for breakfast as well. And what Walk Me Change Management research has shown that 70%, more than 70% of change initiatives fail due to the employee resistance. So again, it's the Drucker culture eats strategy for breakfast in practice. If our culture doesn't enable the change, if our people don't come along that change journey with us, will we ever realize that desired outcome? From the Change Management Institute, they would define change management as a structured application of principles and practices that enable stakeholders of the change to adopt the mindsets, behaviors, and capabilities for the change to fully deliver the desired business value of the initiative. And really, change management happens within a project or a program. And at the heart of change management is the human. Are we bringing our people along the path with us to this future state? Are we engaging with them? Are we equipping them with the mindsets, the behaviors, the capabilities? Are we drawing the future, or do they understand what that future looks like and why we need to get there? And that's within the context of the project or the program activities. Where did changes, what are the drivers of change? Well, as Dave mentioned in the introduction there are numerous drivers for change, some of them external, some of them internal. So external, again, as leaders, we're always looking at what's happening in the external environment, what's happening politically, legislatively, market conditions, how are the market conditions changing? How are our customers or our clients changing? What are their needs and how are they adopting and changing, evolving over time? And then also, what are the opportunities that we see that we can leverage off of and build on for business success? And then internal, how's that going to affect the people, our products, our services, and our processes? And sometimes they come from the internal. We haven't been investing in them and we realize we need to start investing in them and shifting forward. Or they can be driven by the external changes and the adaptation that we need to do in order to achieve those external, meet those external demands. And again, the size of change is a 6-letter word, but when we're talking about change, we can be talking about very small tweaks, incremental step changes, or we can be talking about massive transformations. So just even thinking about what type of change are we in? Are we in an incremental change, such as continuous improvement or Six Sigma? They're much more the incremental change. We're just kind of pushing forward a little bit of change, versus the the step change, those transformational changes. And again, change in terms of incremental is a lot easier for people to cope with, but step change is that transformational change. These are often massive shifts that we're asking people to move from their current into some future state. And sometimes maybe we fell behind in the market. IBM's a great example. When they used to their business plan was all around the mainframe. They completely and utterly missed the personal computer market and what Jobs and Gates were doing. So when they did reposition themselves and looked at the market, they actually made 2 jumps. So they skipped out the personal computer for the most part and moved kind of much more towards the consultation, which is a totally different skill set to mainframes. And so that was a huge, massive transformation that they had to do in that big bang approach. So even the size of the change, what are the drivers? What are the sizes of the change? Small changes are more likely to succeed because they're much closer to what people already know, whereas step changes are much more much more encompassing and much more radical to what people already know. Why is that important? Well, sorry, I'm going to go into the stages of change, but the size of the change we'll see why that becomes important as one of the drivers. So the stages of change, just kind of what are the stages of change? There's the preparing for the change, just like we would with the project or program. What are the preparations we need to make? What do we need to do during the execution? So when the projects and the programs are in the execution phase, what are the things that we need to be doing in change to support the executing of the change, to bring people along that journey? And then finally, how do we embed the change? So again, this is a big part around where change management adds a huge amount of value, because it doesn't say, well, we've executed the change, so therefore we're done, as a lot of times projects do. Really, the change kind of goes, how are we embedding this? How are we making this sticky? How are we ensuring that this new way of working has become our business as usual, and that we realize the value and the benefits we were looking to gain? So for today's session, I've taken out, well, what are 5 drivers for successful change? So the first driver that we're going to look at is the need to contextualize the change. Why do we need to do this? And contextualizing it in terms of where we are and where we want to get to. And I have this picture here for those of you sci-fi fans. And the reason why I have this here is that it always amuses me in sci-fi pictures, sci-fi movies, when they have cars that can drive in the air. And several of the sci-fi movies, they will have the cars still going in a line, following each other in one line, one after the other after the other. And it always amuses me because we do that on the ground because we have a one dimension in our driving. We have the ground, we have paths, we have pedestrians. We need to create the rules of the driving and following one after another on the ground, because there is only one dimension to drive the car. But when you're driving up in the air, there are more dimensions, and there are other, we aren't bound by the constraints of we need to avoid the pedestrians, because there isn't pedestrians walking up in the sky. So it always amuses me how we take the constraints of the ground and apply it to the constraints of a different environment without evaluating, are those constraints still valid or relevant, or are there different constraints? And why does that matter for change? Well, many humans are constrained by what they already know. So their context is what they already see and what they've already experienced and what they already know. There are people, for some people, there are people who can see beyond that. So they can see beyond what the current constraints are, and they can see what that can be. And those people, we would talk about it in terms of intuition. So they're visionary, future orientated, they're conceptual, they're abstract thinking, they're focused on meaning and being able to read through the lines. So as you're describing kind of the future state, they can grasp that, they can conceptualize that, they can see why they might need to go there. And roughly about 50% of the population, using very rough terms here, 50% of the population tends to be intuitive. The other 50% tends to be sensing, and they tend to be practical, down to earth, concrete, focused on what they, the past and the present, what they already know, detailed, orientated, and literal. So for people that are tend towards the sensing, their vision of the future is going to be very much constrained as they think about the future. It's very much constrained by their current understanding of the world, rather than that ability to step out that intuitive people have to look at, well, what can this be? And let's not, be bound by the constraints of what we already know. Let's start imagining. So when we're talking about change, there's that need to contextualize it and let people know, where are we going and how will we know when we get there? So really, really important for the driving of change is we need to be able to succinctly articulate what the future will look like and why we need to get there, and bring people along that journey. The second driver that I've selected is the need to understand the human. So when we look at the human, typically we can only see, when we look at other people, typically just like an iceberg, we can only really see about 10% of their of what they're about. Okay, so we can only see the bit that they show up into the world, how they behave in the world, which is about 10%. And how do we know? How can we observe other people? We observe it through their behaviors, through their speech, through their actions, maybe through decisions that they make, and that gives us a sense of what they're about. But there's about 90% of the person that we can't actually see. It's underneath the line, below the surface, just like an iceberg. And what's underneath the surface is actually informing what we can see of them in the world. So the more that we can understand what's below the surface and what's informing their observable behaviors, the better off we are, the better able we are to influence and to engage with and to bring people along the change journey. And also to use that information around how can we prevent resistance arising, resistance to the change arising, or if it does arise, if people are resistant, how can we use the information, the understanding of the human, and how the layers that we can't see underneath the surface, how can we use that to sort of, I suppose, intervene with and try and minimize and reduce down the resistance. So what are the kinds of things that are going on below the surface for people, for all of us? Firstly, our emotional intelligence, these aren't in any particular order, but our emotional intelligence is one thing. Our energy preferences, so if you've done insights or Myers-Briggs, or whether we're introvert, extrovert, whether intuitive or sensing. So those types of things show up underneath the surface. What our personal values are. Our learning styles, how we like to take in information and learn, becomes important. Our mental models and our world views. So do we view the world as a zero-sum game? If I win, somebody has to lose. If I lose, somebody has to win. Or do we more of a win-win, we can all win here? So these are our mental models. Whether we have a fixed or growth mindset, and to what degree. What are our expectations? And alongside that, what assumptions are we making, which can be informed by some of these models? So what are our expectations? What are our biases? What are our assumptions, and what are our expectations, and what are our mental models around power bases and power differentials? And then finally, what are our motivating factors? So what motivates us and engages us? So there probably are a few others, but this is kind of a good idea of give you the sense of all of the models that we are constantly using, all of us are using, that are below the surface, that then bubble up into what the observable behaviors above the surface. So the more that we can understand these models, the more we can understand, different ways to communicate, how we can use this information to engage people and bring them on that journey of change. Which nicely brings us to the third driver, which is all about communicate, communicate, communicate. And you've probably heard this before and you'll hear it again, but taking from marketing insights, from marketing research, they would say that somebody needs to hear something 7 times before it starts kind of seeping in or resonating with them, or that they start recognizing it. Okay, so it starts sort of seeping into their conscious awareness. So they need to hear it 7 times. But it's not just hearing it 7 times. For somebody who's visual, they will absorb information better through their sight, through seeing images and charts and graphs. So different people will absorb information in different ways. And so some of those ways are visual, it's seeing images. Other people are more auditory, where they can listen to and absorb the information. Other people are kinesthetic. They like to get their hands dirty. They like to kind of really learn through experiencing it, experiential learning, and playing around with it. And that makes it sit and resonate with them more. And then other people prefer reading and writing. So they're happy to read documents, take notes, and that helps them learn. So when we say you need to hear something 7 times, if you're reading, writing, and you're going to a presentation, you might not take in some of that information. So it's not just 7 times, it's 7 times, it might be 10 times, 15 times by the time we've done it through different forms of communication, different mediums, so that different people will pick up the information in the way that best suits them. And just in case you're thinking, well, I told them something, or I verbally told them something and they should have heard it, or they should have picked it up, just as a statistic for you, only about 10 people have a preference for auditory. So they only about 10% of people will listen to something only seeing or only hearing the words with no visuals like you're getting here to support it, and they will absorb the information. So if you find yourself telling people a lot of things without without images, without graphs, without giving them opportunities to try things out, there might be a need to shift and move to other forms of communication, other mediums. In relation to the communication and stages of change, what kinds of things what would be the typical communication methods and tools? Well, when we're preparing for change, the whole discussion around the need for change, why do we need to do this? What would the outcomes be? What are we trying to achieve from it? All those discussions feed into the communication, and then agreeing the change. The whole project planning, change planning, that sort of thing, allocation of resources, these are all kind of ways that we communicate in the planning stage. Socializing the project and change, again, socializing the ideas, and then the initial kickoffs and communications. These are all very good ways of forms that we use to communicate. Again, knowing that we now have to use visuals, graphics, examples, etc. When we're executing to the change, when we get into executing the change, things like change objectives, meetings, weekly meetings, regular meetings, those sorts of things, informal chats, process design, again, how we're redesigning the future processes, procedures, regular updates, training initiatives, these all support the communication. And why I say this is sometimes people don't recognize that these are actually conduits to communication. And again, decisions, whatever decisions we make communicates to people. sends messages. And embedding change at the embedding stage, things like the new procedures and processes that are available, new templates, outputs, new KPIs, successes, new roles, or new org design, if you're going, if the change is resulting in that. These are all ways that we can communicate the embedded change. So it's not just about, having a presentation and a meeting. There's loads of different ways we communicate. And again, the other on the subject of biases, using the availability bias or considering the availability bias when we're involved in change. In reality, when there's change initiatives, in reality, there's lots of different organizational information that's available across the information. And a lot of people's their focus is on their day jobs, what they're doing in business as usual, and so they're focused in on that. So the actual information available around the change might be very small within the wider context of the amount of information that people are being sent to them and absorbing and using and applying. But when we're heavily involved in the change initiatives, whether we're leading them, we're a sponsor or a change initiative manager, when we're heavily involved in the change, what we see is we're focusing in on the change initiative. And so the availability bias says, well, my availability of what I'm hearing is all around the change. So what I see, so in my mind, the change is the most important thing. But for other people working in the organization, they're not seeing that. They're seeing other pieces of information. So you might be so imbued in the change and all the information about thinking everybody has heard this. And this is a really, really common thing for change leaders to experience, and for other people to experience with those change leaders. They're so enmeshed in the change and the discussing it, and that they almost forget other people have to be brought along that journey as well. So always keeping in mind, okay, this might be a big thing to me. I might know all of this, but I know if I haven't communicated, if I know I haven't communicated, then I need to know that I have to communicate, and again, supporting the communication message. The fourth driver is the monitoring the adoption rate. So all of these interactions, these interventions are leading towards that people are connecting with that future state, connecting with the change, what they need to do differently, and that they are getting on board and supporting the change. And this is typically done through the monitoring of the adoption rate. And what we're really trying to get to is that kind of the momentum of change going, that we feel that the momentum is building. So what we're trying to get to is the tipping point, that enough people have bought into the change and connect with the change and support the change, that the momentum of all of that will bring us to the end, our end goal and our outcomes. And typically this is the technology life cycle, which again, I always think people think is from the current amount of technology that we're all experiencing, but actually the cycle came from the social sciences in 1957. And what they identified is that there's 5 different groups: the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and the laggards. And the innovators and the early adopters they're the ones that are more likely to be intuitive. They can see what can be. They're playing around with things. They're excited about doing things differently. And the rest of which is only, you can see there with the bell curve, there's only about 16% of the population. Everybody else falls into the early majority, late majority, or laggards. So when we're kind of very, at the early stages of change and what the initiatives are and what we're trying to achieve, these innovators and early adopters are the ones more likely to support the change. And they need to start influencing and connecting with the early majority of people, and lead them towards why they should engage with the change. We can see this, we've got this chasm here. So a lot of change initiatives, a lot of projects, and a lot of new products fall into the chasm of the gap, never to be heard of from again. So a lot of times the early majority are waiting to see, is this really going to take off, or do we really need to engage, as does the late majority and the laggards. So we need not only energy to engage with the early majority to get them on board, but also to put in enough energy to overcome that chasm. So in organizational terms, if you're an organization that has lots of change initiatives, or you keep putting shiny new things, as I call it, you keep bringing in changes and new initiatives, and that a lot of them will end up falling into this chasm as people don't get to the end of them and kind of go keep the head down, say nothing, it'll be all over in 6 months' time. So that's a typical example of a chasm in organizations looking to move towards some future state. So again, with in terms of once we get the momentum going, we're looking for the tipping point, and the tipping point is probably around, we've started engaging with the late majority. We haven't got all of them, but we've got some of them on board, and the momentum, people can see, okay, this is really happening. The momentum is building. We can feel the energy, and we are and start kind of that momentum brings us towards our end goals. Do we need to get everybody on board? No. Can we get everybody on board? No, we definitely can't. But do we need to focus on them? So, the skeptics, the laggards, there's a lot of these we won't ever get on board. Some of the late majority we won't get on board. Some of them will come on board as they see towards the end, as they see other people getting involved. But to what degree do we need to focus in on them? And in my experience, what I recommend is that you need to look at identifying who these people are, and look to see how much power and influence they have on their peers. If they have a lot of power and influence, they will be talking negatively. They will be subtly sabotaging the change initiative to their peers, who will be listening to them because they're leaders. They're seen as leaders in social groups, and they will start taking away their support as they're listening more and more to the late people in the late majority laggards who have that level of influence on others. If the people that don't have that level of influence, then we don't necessarily need to pay as much attention. And what we do need to do is keep monitoring it to make sure that it isn't that they aren't gaining in influence. And the fifth driver is the need to embed the change. So at the beginning, I said the outcome is that we embed the change, and that future state becomes the way we do business. So here's a philosophical question for you on a Thursday. It's a rhetorical question because you won't be answering it, but a philosophical question for Thursday afternoon. If we eat the donut, does the donut hole still exist? And in change, the equivalent philosophical question is, if we implemented the change but we didn't embed it, did the change ever happen? So sometimes we get to the end of the change, we've kind of everything's built out, we've got some level of momentum, and then it all slides back. We regress 3 months, 6 months, 12 months later, we've regressed back to the way we used to do things. So does it, did the change ever happen? And in terms of resources, the answer is yes, we did. We used all of those resources to do that change. But in terms of business value, no, we never got the value of it. So yes, it did in terms of our resources, but it never happened in terms of where we were wanting the change to bring us to, and the business value that would accrue from that. So as with any change, regardless of whatever the change is, the end goal is that we embed the future state into the way we now do business. So that is our end goal regardless, and that we realize whatever value we thought we were going to get from having that future state, from achieving that future state. So that's always the end goal, and it's always, linking back to communication, if you're leading out or you're managing change, it's always reiterating, constantly reminding people where's the end goal, because people forget. They get attached to the journey and they forget where they're trying to get to, and particularly those that are more on the sensing side. And remembering that change is a marathon, not a sprint. So a lot of times, particularly in fast-paced organizations, the focus is on getting the infrastructure built, so getting the project activities done, and then we'll have it built, and then it'll just, it'll be there and we'll use it and it'll be great. And one client in particular was very much a sprint. He was a partner in a company, in an organization, and himself and one of his associates went off and they built out the whatever the future state process was that they needed. So they built that out, but nobody came with them. They didn't bring anybody with them, and they had this fabulous asset sitting there in the organization that didn't see the light of day, and there was of no value to the organization. So I was helping him to see, actually, if you don't bring the people with you, it's irrelevant whether you ever build it, because it will never be embedded. So change is a marathon. There's a lot of hard work that can be done up front to get the momentum going, to get the people, enough people buying into the moving up that adoption curve, to get the energy going, to get it to get you to the end of the marathon. So a huge amount of work needs to be done to sort of really get the momentum going early on, and that's enough, hopefully, and we need to maintain it, but that's what we need to do in order to get to the end of the marathon, rather than just rushing ahead with other rushing ahead of other people and not bringing them with us. So we might get to the end goal of having the infrastructure, but if we don't bring the people with us and embed it, then we don't actually get the benefits. And just 39%, again, going back to a few statistics here, 39% of projects fail due to a shift in organizations' priorities. So roughly 40% of projects fail. And again, going back to we've depleted our resources by doing that. So we've emptied the tank of people's engagement and people's goodwill to the organization if we keep shifting our organizational priorities. We start projects and then we kind of go, no, we're not doing that. We've changed our project, or we've changed our priority to something else. Let's move over to there. And that constant cycle of it is a huge waste of resources, and it's has a huge impact on project success or failure. So it depletes our energy tanks. It reduces our cash. We've paid for resources that we've never gotten the benefits for, so we're wasting our cash. We're wasting time. So if we thought this was important, and we've put in 2 months, 6 months, 12 months into it, and then we just change our priorities without ever getting the value of it or the benefits, we've wasted that amount of time. And we've also potentially undermined our position in the market, because our competitors are moving ahead. They're keeping going in what they think the right place to go, the end goal is. And so we've wasted time and we've allowed them to get ahead of ourselves. So for organizations that are in this space, it's not just the change of the business, the change initiative that they're trying to achieve, but also in these sort of organizations, they also need to look at the culture that they have and how that culture is undermining their ability to lead, to effectively lead out and achieve change. So just that 40% of projects, what you'll find is the detail of it is that there will be certain types of organizations where their failure rate is maybe more like 60-70% because they keep changing the priorities, and other organizations have a much lower rate because they stick to their priorities and see it through to the end. So just a reminder of the 5 drivers of successful change. Driver 1 is to contextualize the need for change. So bringing those people who are more sensing along that journey and helping them see what the future can be. Driver 2 is understand the human. There's a lot of different drivers for the human underneath the surface. By understanding them, we can leverage that insights into helping us bring people along the journey to the change. Communicate, communicate, communicate. We need to communicate at least 7 times the messages, and using different means or modes of channels of getting the information, sharing the information, be it visual, images, experiential, listening, or reading, writing. The 4th driver is monitoring the adoption rate. So again, keeping an eye on the adoption rate. If the people are adopting it and getting on board, great. If not, where are the barriers? Where are the blockages? What's going on? Using our understanding of the human to unblock the blockages, and so that we can again get that tipping point and get the momentum building. And the 5th one is the need to embed the change. If we don't ever embed the change, if the desired end goal doesn't become business as usual, we have wasted a huge amount of resources, and we're back where we started, or somewhere not anywhere close to where we intend to go. So on that note, I shall finish up and hand back to Dave.
Thanks a million, Irial, and for that taster of the topic of change. And I think when you talked a few minutes ago about the human aspect and the 10%, I think it's nearly very similar to we're really just covering a very high level aspect of this whole topic, probably even 1% of what it is. The whole area of change management could cover over days and hours. So I know it's a challenge to get a very succinct and condensed view of the value chain, what it is. We talked about what it is, the types of change, be it incremental or step change, the stages in change, and then critically you focus a lot on the key drivers of change. So I think there's a huge amount of food for thought for leaders and managers in business today. Again, just to remind you, if anyone has any questions, please post them through the Q&A functionality. If you don't mind, Irial, I'll jump in with a few questions I have myself, and it's specifically around culture. I think culture is a key driver here to change. And do you have any suggestions or advice on how to create that culture. And I suppose from my view in it, I've heard a lot about psychological safety as an aspect of it, but can you maybe talk about that? Or is there any other elements on how you create that culture?
Yeah, so I mean, creating as with all cultures, the culture comes from the top. So the leaders being aware of their own preferences and how they're influencing and shaping the culture, and is the culture helpful to them in terms of moving towards the future state or not. So some of that, cultures that don't do planning, for example, they just jump in with 2 feet and they move on, they start going. That's where you're going to get that cycle whereby people are starting in projects and then realizing that the priorities have changed and shifted. So they don't have that discipline to keep going with things. So if that's imbued in the culture, it's going to be very difficult to embed the change and get to the end goals. Psychological safety is really important. So Google has shown that from their research, what creates kind of increases effectiveness of teams and capability is having that psychological safety. And the 2 things that are required to build it out are that everybody gets the opportunity to speak up and to contribute, and that they also have a high level of emotional intelligence. So those are kind of the 2 I suppose, drivers of creating psychological safety. And psychological safety is that feeling that I can speak up and I can contribute things and I can say things, and I'm not going to be penalized, or I'm not going to be ridiculed, or I'm not going to be put down, so that people feel open and free to put forward suggestions. And of course, one of the big things with change is that we need to get to the end goal and know where we're going to, but we can tap into people's ideas and capabilities and expertise to help us to build that change. So even leaders that feel that in a culture that it's like, we'll tell you how to do it, that kind of culture isn't going to be particularly effective in bringing people along that journey of change, because they will be very much, when you just tell us and we'll do it, and it's an acquiescence type culture. It's not tapping into whether people really want to get on board and connect with that change. So that's where you often get that we'll go through the process of this and we get to the end. But if that culture doesn't keep going, the embedding never happens, because the leader changes, and people go, great, I don't have to do that anymore, just revert back to what I was doing. So there's a lot of different things that can feed into the culture, creating the culture of change.
As individuals and as managers and leaders, I assume role modeling is key as well in that aspect.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The big thing, I mean, again, affecting change and leadership are very 2 sides of the one coin. People look up to their leaders, whoever is in power. They look upwards and go, what are they doing? And that must be what we're supposed to do. And they reflect it. So leaders who are going, I don't really like the culture of my organization, there's a lot of self-reflection that might need to start with themselves.
Yeah, no, true, very true. And are there subtle differences though in managing and then leading change? So I think, and again, probably more links into where you are positioned in the business. But you talked about sponsors as well earlier, and change management. Maybe just touch on that a little bit if you could.
Yeah, so usually the change sponsor, the program sponsor, they're quite senior people. They're the leaders, and they're there more to kind of provide the direction, provide the framework, and it gives some sense of the pathway that might be used to get to the end goal. But they're not going to get into the detail of it. They don't have the time. It's not, at this stage, it's not a good use of their time. That's not the value that they bring. So they will typically have a team of change people who will, again, depending on the size of the project, of course, and the program. But they would that change manager role is the one that's kind of much more front facing, much more in the detail of how we are going to bring people along this change, understanding the stages of the project or the program, and then what needs to happen, and then tapping into the people managers, the frontline managers of people that are affected by the change, the trainers, the communication, if they've got communication, people who can do the communications, they're sort of managing the data, running the day-to-day activities of the change. And then of course they might have change agents who are supporters of the change throughout the business. They'll be tapping into them, liaising with the people managers of teams that are going to be impacted by the change, and checking in with them and keeping them in the loop, and making sure that their people are understanding the training needs and how they're going to need to learn new skills and new capabilities to be able to operate in the new world. So they're tapping into all of that. So again, if it's a big change, there's a huge amount of work that is required to be done, and the leaders are just not going to have that time. So they're more kind of monitoring, keeping an eye on, removing any blockages that might be happening across a function or parts of the organization, as necessary. Again, to unblock the any resistance that might be happening.
Sounds like there's a big ecosystem of individuals contributing to it, but needs governance, needs strong and
Yeah.
rigorous governance around
Yeah.
it. Just you touched on the adoption rate, so I thought it was really interesting the way you had the early laggards and early adopters, etc. We've now got 5 generations working in a workforce. That's what I was reading recently there with Harvard Business Review. Is there anything to say that there's a different mindset with each generation around change? Like some are more open to it, more responsive, or is there anything that's coming out on that side of things to be wary of for people?
Yeah, well, in Ireland we probably only have 4 generations, if that makes you feel
Yeah.
In the US, the silent generation, some of them might still be working as as maybe their pension pots got eroded, or
exactly.
So we probably only have 4, but yeah, I mean, like, obviously stages of life have a huge bearing on how people respond to change. The baby boomers, the older generation, some of them are starting to get ready for retirement, and they're kind of going, will I be around for this? Will I be? That's going to have a bearing on it. Do I really want to be? Do I need to be putting in the energy into this? So that can play a part. The likes the Gen Z and the millennials are more likely to kind of going, yeah, we're here for a while, so probably want to get on board. The Gen Z coming in, they are, in some ways, they don't necessarily know any different, because they might not have had that much experience. However, I suppose that generation is kind of very wanting to know and as are the millennials, they want to know why we're doing this. So that's where that vision of the change and where we're trying to get to and why we're trying to get there. That contextualizing it can be really, really important, and not just contextualizing it in terms of internally within the organization, but sort of seeing beyond the organization into the marketplace and what are we trying to do in relation to our competitors, because particularly Gen Z, just off of not having that much experience or whatever, it's hard to see the wider, have that wider appreciation of the organization in the wider context of the industry or the marketplace that they're in.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Look, you talked about the 5 drivers. So that's some key takeaways for people who are on the webinar this afternoon. Any useful change models that are out there that people could look at? Are there something that they could take away as a toolkit to use and support them in any of the change initiatives that they're working with?
Yeah, so I would kind of say, unfortunately, there's no change model, because if it's big change initiatives, you've got the change happening at a macro level and a micro level, and so I don't think any of the change models really capture both sides of it. Some of the models that would be used at the macro level would be the likes of the Kotter 8 steps or the Lewin change, the unfreeze, change and refreeze model at the kind of macro level. So having that kind of, is the change, what's the change, what's the drivers, what's the size of the change, are we ready for this change, all those sorts of questions. So those are useful models at the macro level. At the micro level, which is where the change really happens, and that's why the change management is all about the human. I really like the ADKAR model from the in terms of the awareness, which feeds into the communication, their desire, which is their motivations, and then do they have the knowledge and skills to be able to implement the future state, and they also have that reinforcement. So at an individual level, I think it's a really useful tool. And then obviously you can look at the trends in it, and are there where are each of the functions, or where are each of the departments or the business units, or are there pockets of resistance? It can be useful from that point of view. And then again, just being aware of the emotional roller coaster of change that people can go through. And again, a bit like the the availability bias that I talked about there, when we're very immersed in the change, we're kind of getting all of the information, we're surrounded by it. In the same way, we've already gone through that roller coaster of emotions. We've gotten used to the idea, we've accepted it, and we've moved on. So it's remembering, I might be 2 or 3 steps ahead of other people. keeping that awareness there that they will go through a roller coaster of emotions. So the bridges, I think, is a really useful model from that point of view around the emotional roller coaster of change.
Right. Okay, thanks. Brian's just asked us to outline the ACCR model again. It's awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. Okay,
Yeah,
so
that model there.
and just last question before we finish. It's sneak peek around the corner then. What's the future hold in the world of change management? And we're talking about skills and skill sets today, and we're kind of reframing soft skills as the power skills, but what do the future leaders need to have as skills when it comes to change?
I think one of the things is, I think even still, even though change has been around for, last probably 15, 20 years, I think people, there's that understanding of the role it can really play in success of achieving the future state. I think there's a lot of leaders out there that still are, they kind of see it as the soft, fluffy stuff there, kind of go off and just see if they, there isn't that full appreciation. And I always say this, the soft skills are, they're soft until they don't work, and then it's like running into a brick wall. So when soft skills work, when this sort of stuff works, when you've got a culture of change, the people accepted it, they've got growth mindsets, all those sorts of things. When you have that, like it all works and it feels like it's all good and easy. But when you don't have that, it is like pushing water up a hill. And that's when it is like running into a brick wall. So I think actually really for leaders to really understand what is change management. There's some kind of very hard things around change management, understanding the role it plays, what it really means, and seeing the value in that, I think is hugely, is that kind of, I suppose, that next evolution of it. I don't think the human is fundamentally going to change in any great, I think we haven't changed that much in many centuries, so I'm not sure we're fundamentally going to change. We are still social animals. We do kind of respond to influence and power and all that kind of stuff, and suggestibility and our biases and all that good stuff. I don't think that's changing anytime soon. But I think the value that organizations can leverage from understanding the human and using that information is, I think that probably that next evolution of really seeing it fully embedded in organizations. I think organizations are aware that there is huge value in it, but there's the cognitive and then there's the emotional, now I get it, is the bit that I'm not sure we're fully at yet.
Last question from Sarah. How do you manage different personality types and neurodiversity in terms of change? We'll finish on that.
Yeah, great question around, and that again goes back to understanding the human. So if you do have neurodiverse people in your team, it's understanding, what type of neurodiversity, if you have that level of detail, understanding the type of neurodiversity that they might have, and how does that show up in sort of, I suppose, collectively, how does that typically show up? And using that information to communicate or to engage with people with that neurodiversity in that sense. So, there can be, with neurodiversity, for example, one example could be very black and white thinking. And so you might need to kind of ask questions to get them to see other options and kind of guide them that way. So it's kind of understanding how does that neurodiversity show up and how would we need to use that information to engage and connect with people with that neurodiversity. So I mean, I would say it's another lens for understanding the human, albeit it might only be applicable to a certain, a small percentage. Similarly with dyslexia, if you have somebody as a neurodivergent, if you've got somebody with dyslexia, they're obviously, reading and writing and words isn't going to work for them. So videos, hearing, images, that kind of stuff would help them absorb that information an awful lot more.
Irial, look, thanks a million for the session. I think you said at the start it's a small word. It's a 6-letter word, but it's actually quite a complicated subject and very an area that has huge implications for businesses and leaders and can transform, as you alluded to earlier, be it incrementally or through step change. So look, really appreciate your insights, again, as I allude to, on a very condensed session here today. If people are interested, we also have, if you just flick the next slide there, we have a a change management program that's happening in a couple of weeks. So it's on 13th and 14th. It's 2 days in classroom in our head office in Tower Street. So if you're interested, please do reach out to us. We're offering people a 10% discount today who've joined the session. So if you want to connect in with the team afterwards, please do. And finally, I alluded at the start, this is a new initiative that is part of the Power Hour series. The next session we're going to be doing is in March, and we're going to be talking about the power to coach. And we're going to talk about the whole area of coaching and the value of that for individuals and teams. It's actually on the next slide there. So if you want, you can sign up to our website there and sign up for that session. Again, it's a free session, so please do look at that and share the information with individuals in your business as well. Again, we will talk through the value of coaching, and again in a very bite-sized session. So look, all I can do is thank Irial for a really productive and insightful session. I hope you really enjoyed it. It's, as I said, the first of our series. You'll hear lots more coming from the Irish Times training across the year. We really appreciate you tuning in today. And from myself and the team at Irish Times, have a great day and take care. Thank you.